What is right view really? Is it knowledge, correct Buddhist understanding, reading enough sutras, memorizing teachings, learning the right spiritual ideas? Many people quietly assume that right view means having the correct understanding of Buddhism. So they study, they learn about impermanence, about karma, about non-self, about suffering. Some can explain the teachings beautifully. Pause for a moment and ask yourself honestly, is that where you are right now? Studying, searching, hoping that the right understanding will finally arrive. Because if right view were simply correct knowledge, then surely the people who knew the most Buddhism would already be free. And yet, many people can speak about suffering clearly, while still suffering in exactly the same ways. Still resisting pain, still disturbed by criticism, still afraid of loss, still shaken when life refuses to follow their expectations. And this may be the uncomfortable part. Someone can spend 40 years studying Buddhism, while never actually seeing clearly for even one moment. Even Ananda, the Buddha's own attendant, the one who memorized thousands of teachings, who sat beside the Buddha longer than almost anyone, did not awaken through memory alone. Something else had to fall away, something that no amount of learning could remove. And this is where the misunderstanding begins, because right view is not the accumulation of truth. It is what remains when distortion, self-centered interpretation, and mental projection begin to dissolve. So then, if right view is not something you merely collect through knowledge, how does it actually arise? And how does an ordinary person begin seeing clearly? There is something subtle that happens after many years of studying anything, especially spirituality. The mind slowly replaces reality with concepts about reality. A person hears, "Everything is impermanent," and eventually the sentence feels familiar, comfortable. But familiar ideas are not the same as direct seeing. Someone can repeat the word impermanence for 30 years and still panic when the body begins to weaken, still suffer when relationships change, still fear aging, still fear death. Why? Because the ideas remained in thought, while the heart continued reacting from attachment. A Buddhist teacher once said that right view is not correct knowledge, and that many people have correct knowledge and still do not have right view. That is difficult for the ego to accept, because the ego quietly believes, if I learn enough, I will finally become spiritually secure. But the Dharma points in a very different direction. The problem is not simply that we lack knowledge. The problem is that the mind continuously places ideas, judgments, fears, and identities on top of reality itself. And eventually, we stop seeing life directly. We only see our interpretation of life. After 60, many people begin noticing this for the first time. Not philosophically, personally. The body changes. Children become distant. The house grows quieter. The television stays on later into the night. Meals become silent. Some mornings the phone never rings. And suddenly, all the spiritual concepts in the world cannot completely protect a person from what is actually being felt. This is where real practice begins, not in theories, but in direct encounter. So what is right view? Right view is not a belief system. It is not spiritual ideology. It is not forcing yourself to think positively. And it is not convincing yourself that you are detached. Right view is the ability to see reality before the mind distorts it, before the ego turns experience into identity. In early Buddhist teaching, there is a simple phrase: in seeing, just the seen. In hearing, just the heard. Simple words, but extraordinarily deep, because most of us never actually experience life this way. We do not simply hear a sound. Immediately, the mind comments, I like this, I dislike this. This reminds me of something, this should not be happening. We do not simply feel sadness. We become a sad person, a lonely person, a forgotten person. A tightness in the chest becomes, nobody understands me. A quiet evening becomes, I have been left behind. The mind quietly adds a self to every experience, and suffering grows from there. Right view begins the moment this process is noticed clearly, not intellectually, directly. Imagine an older person waking in the morning with pain in the knees. The room is still dim. The house is still silent. Normally, the mind reacts before a single breath is taken. I'm getting old. My life is declining. I used to be stronger. This is terrible. But before all those thoughts, there was only sensation, pressure, tightness, heat, pulsing. Then the mind arrived and built a story called My Suffering. Right view does not deny that pain. It simply sees more clearly how psychological suffering gets constructed, layer by layer, moment by moment, thought by thought. This is why the Dharma is not pessimistic. It is precise. It looks carefully at what suffering actually is, and at how the mind quietly creates even more of it. This is where many sincere practitioners become confused. They ask, how do I develop right view? But hidden inside that question there can already be a subtle misunderstanding. Because the ego immediately imagines a future version of itself that will finally have right view, more advanced, more spiritual, more awakened. But the Dharma is not ultimately about constructing a better self. It is about seeing through the self that keeps trying to construct itself. That is why right view cannot simply be manufactured through effort alone. A teacher can describe truth, but description is not seeing. Someone can describe fire perfectly, its color, its heat, its danger, and still not know what it feels like to touch it. And eventually, life itself becomes the teacher, especially later in life. After 60, the illusions become harder to maintain. You begin losing control over things you once depended on. Health changes, energy changes, people leave, plans fail, the future becomes uncertain. And strangely, this is not necessarily punishment, it is revelation, because suffering exposes the places where attachment was hidden. A person may believe they understand impermanence, but when loneliness arrives one evening, unexpected, sitting across from them at the dinner table like an uninvited guest, something entirely different appears, their actual view. A person may calmly discuss detachment for years at meditation retreats. Then one diagnosis arrives, one phone call, and suddenly every philosophy disappears. A person may say they know the self is an illusion, but when criticized, something ignites immediately. If you've ever felt that gap between what you believe and how you actually respond, you already know exactly what this teaching is pointing at. This is not failure, this is seeing. And seeing clearly, even painfully, is already the beginning of wisdom. Right view does not arise because the ego forces itself to become enlightened. It arises when distortion is gradually seen and released. This is extremely important. The path is not adding more spiritual identity. The path is seeing more honestly. At first, a person suffers unconsciously. The suffering simply happens, and then the story about the suffering begins, and the two feel like one thing. Then slowly, they begin noticing the hidden assumptions underneath suffering. This moment should be different. My children should understand me. I should not be aging. I should not lose what I love. These assumptions feel completely natural. They feel like reality itself. But when examined carefully, really carefully, not intellectually but in the body, in the chest, in the jaw, they are often forms of resistance against reality itself. And then something important begins happening. The person starts seeing not only the pain, but the extra suffering created by mental resistance. The pain was here. The story about the pain was added afterward, and this changes everything. Because now, instead of immediately escaping experience, the mind begins observing it. Sadness is seen. Fear is seen. Attachment is seen, not judged, not suppressed, not spiritually decorated, just seen. And through repeated seeing, illusion slowly weakens. A Buddhist teacher once explained it this way: the false is what we create, and the true is already there. This means right view is not something added onto reality. It appears naturally when false seeing begins falling away. Like muddy water left undisturbed in a bowl, slowly the dirt settles by itself. The clarity was never created, it was only obscured. Nobody forces the water to become clear. The disturbance simply stops interfering, and clarity appears naturally. This is why genuine practice often becomes simpler over time, not more dramatic. Simpler, more honest, more direct. A person sits quietly late in the evening. The room is silent. A distant motorbike passes outside. The refrigerator hums softly somewhere in the house. Sadness appears, and for the first time, not the first time it arrived, but the first time it was allowed to arrive. Instead of immediately reaching for distraction, instead of explaining the sadness to themselves, instead of turning it into a story about who they are, they simply remain present with what is here, breathing, feeling the weight of the body in the chair, hearing distant sounds, watching thoughts rise and pass away without following any of them. And in that moment, there is slightly less resistance, slightly less self, slightly more clarity. That is already the beginning of right view arising. Perhaps right view is closer than most people think, not hidden in complicated philosophy, not waiting at the end of spiritual achievement, but quietly present beneath all the mental noise we continuously add to life. Maybe this is why the deepest teachings often sound so simple: in seeing just the seen, in hearing just the heard. No extra self, no extra story, no unnecessary struggle. Tonight, when the house becomes quiet, before reaching for distraction, before turning the moment into a problem, pause for just 1 second and notice what is actually here before the mind begins commenting on it. What remains before identity forms. That simple, unadorned seeing may already be closer to right view than years of accumulated spiritual knowledge. Perhaps clarity was never far away, only covered by the constant movement of the mind. If something in this video landed for you, not as an idea but as a recognition, leave a word or two in the comments below. Not what you think about it, what you actually noticed.